Well, hey everyone, I can't believe it. Happy New Year. It's January 1st, and this is the beginning of Season 3 of Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. Over the last couple of years, we've had just an amazing array of fascinating guests, and we intend to keep doing that until we run out of amazing Canadians to talk to. So we'll see how long this podcast lasts. So my guest today is another Kevin. Kevin Aaron Wiebe is a pastor, and he grew up below the poverty line in Western Canada. In his book, he talks about how his mother would hunt for change in the couch to buy food for the baby. And now he pastors a low-resource church of mostly immigrants, and it's a congregation that transcends definitions of the helper and the helped, and it doesn't fit into any stereotype of poverty. A few years ago, he developed Pov.ology, Pov.ology. It's a website, small group curriculum on poverty in the church, and he pulled together some great guests and minds in that series. Most recently, he's authored a new book entitled Faithful in Small Things, How to Serve the Needy When You're One of Them. And that's something that is good for me to read, because sometimes I feel like I'm just as needy as the people that I reach out to. And the book shows readers that writing big checks isn't the only, maybe not even the best way to alleviate poverty. It's small acts of love that change the world in Jesus' name. It's small acts of love that are a vital aspect of following Jesus. Jesus ministered to the poor even though Jesus himself was poor. And if both those things are true of our Savior, then they can be true of us too. So welcome, Kevin Wiebe. Great to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yeah. I just want to jump right into the book and quote you, if that's okay. Do you mind listening to yourself?
I used to work in radio, so I had to do a lot of that back then. So
okay.
Go for it.
So on page 71, chapter 6, the good news. When I was a child, my family and I were considered the working poor. There were many in our world poorer than us, and since my dad always worked, I never had to go to bed with an empty stomach. We were never forced to sleep outside because even when we lost our home when I was 8 years old, we had family who took us in. From before I was born, my parents helped people who had nowhere to go, and we had a great many house guests, some staying for days or weeks, and others staying for months or years. I know what it is like to go without a telephone. That was rather nice, actually. There was a season when we went without indoor plumbing, and for years of my upbringing, the only heat in our home through the bitter cold Canadian winters was from a wood stove. We would glean firewood from wood piles at the local lumber mills that were destined for the burner as waste, cutting up the bent and splintered logs in the evenings and on weekends. No matter how bad things got, however, we never had to go without food. We had clothes on our backs, and I was keenly aware that we were more privileged than others because of how often we would encounter people in need, people who were always welcome in our home and around the table. I'd love to hear more about your childhood and growing up in that environment of having so many people in your parents' home. You know, I think a lot of people don't have anybody into their home, but you grew up the opposite to that. Yeah. And I don't know if there's some kind of difference between the more wealth you have, the less people you have in your home, or how it works? But talk about your experience.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I know that my dad had a knack for befriending people who were in need. And in the book, I talk a lot about like when you read the stories about my parents, you'd think they must be some kind of super saints, but what you got to realize is they're ordinary people, and they have the same brokenness that the rest of us have, and in some ways even more than other people. Mm-hmm. But the thing about my parents is, I know they love Jesus, mm-hmm. and I know that when they read in the scriptures, they see Jesus reaching out to others. They read things when Jesus says, whatever you've done to the least of these brothers of mine, you've done for me. They read about how Jesus kind of looks at people differently. Instead of valuing only those with money or power, he values, the little person or the person that's ignored by the rest of the world. And so that's kind of the framework that I grew up around, was my parents looking for people. Well, mostly my dad. It was usually my dad that would come home with someone for a meal or to live with us for a while. And my mom was always hospitable. She would always, the joke was for years is that we just watered down the soup. And so she'd, make soup. And sometimes that's what she would do, is add a little more water to the soup and get out an extra bag of buns. And we always had homemade buns because they were cheaper than buying bread at the store. So that's one of the benefits of that, I guess, is my mom put a lot of work into home-cooked meals that were very cost-effective. So she'd get out an extra bag of buns and a little more water in the soup, and then we had enough for everybody. And so our stomachs were always filled. But it was one of those things that when I think about that upbringing, and even in the really lean years when we didn't have a furnace in the house, or
no indoor plumbing.
No indoor plumbing.
Yeah.
That was it was less than a year anyway.
Yeah.
We were able
Thank God.
Yeah. But my family, my wife and my children thinks it's very funny when I talk about how I envied my uncle's outhouse because it was nicer than ours. One of those peculiarities of my upbringing, I suppose.
So right now I know that some people are saying, wait a second, I thought this was a podcast about urban ministry in Canadian cities. But you've never been a city boy, but you've always mostly lived in the orbit of a city, right?
Yeah. And from when I was 9 till when I was 23, I believe it was, we lived in extremely rural Canada. But other than that, before then and then since then, we've lived in small towns kind of in the orbit of cities. And so the people that my dad would find before we lost our home, when we lived near Edmonton, it was mm-hmm. been a bedroom community to Edmonton. So some of the people that came to stay with us and spent some months living with our family, my dad got to know through, he'd go to the city for parts as a mechanic or whatever. And he'd get to know people in the city that were in need and invite them home, and they'd come home with him and then, stay with us until they got back up on their feet, and then they'd move on.
Your dad, was he a really good judge of character to know who to invite to come live in your house, or was it kind of hit and miss? Like,
as far as I've ever heard from my siblings and from my own experience, there were never any incidents of anyone like taking advantage of hospitality or stealing from us or those kinds of things. That I can't remember a single time that would happen. There were ground rules, of course. He said never come home drunk or anything like mm-hmm. that, and someone only broke that rule once in my memory, but otherwise the people were very, very respectful. And given the number of people that stayed with our family, and that only happened once in my entire upbringing, I don't know if it's my dad's character or like sometimes some of the people that would come to visit, these people never lived with us, but they were self-proclaimed thieves, mm-hmm. right? But they never ever stole from our family. And there was respect for my dad, and so then they didn't want to hurt him or his family. And a lot of times when we think about people we tend to stereotype them into a certain category, and we think we want to distance ourselves from these bad people. But you know what?
Boy, do we ever! Yeah,
those people need love too, and often when you care for people, then it doesn't always end up like what you might expect of people taking advantage of you. Yeah.
Well, I don't know your dad, but just based on what I'm reading in the book and what you're saying, I kind of think he must have had a good excrement detector. And he must have been able to size up a person in a few key ways to be able to say, I'm going to bring you home with me. And he must have been a little bit courageous, you know. It's interesting that they didn't come looking for him. He had an eye to find them, it sounds like.
It definitely felt that way, yeah. And he just had a way of connecting with people that was kind of disarming in some ways, where people felt comfortable around him. Where, I mean, he's not a very judgmental person, you know, and so no matter who you are, no matter what your criminal record says, he views you as a person, you know, and that's an extremely valuable lesson, you know.
Yeah. Are your folks still alive?
Yes, they just moved to a small town on the outskirts of Edmonton again.
Ah, very good. So you pastor in a little church in Stevensville, is it?
Stevenson.
Stevenson?
Yeah.
Just on Lake Erie, a couple miles in from Lake Erie.
Yeah.
Closest town, Tilbury.
That's right, yeah.
You pastor a church that has a lot of Mexican Mennonites in it.
Yes.
So tell me a bit about the Mexican Mennonites, the culture, who they are, and what brings them all the way up north to the southernmost part of Canada.
Yeah. Mexican Mennonites are an interesting group of people because you'll see them eating Russian food. You'll hear them speaking Low German, and they have white skin, but they hold Mexican passports. And so sometimes when I talk about my congregation to people who don't know, they find this kind of blend of pieces of our identity a little bit confusing. Some of it goes all the way back to the Reformation, but since the Reformation, they and we have been traveling from place to place. And during the Russian Revolution, many moved to Canada from Russia, and from there, then some migrated to Mexico, including my grandparents. No, actually, my grandparents migrated back from Mexico, is what it was. So my grandparents would also hold Mexican passports, or would have. But then some, back and forth from Mexico for a few generations, and more recently, many have chosen to settle in southwestern Ontario, in Leamington, Wheatley, Tilbury area, and surrounding as well. And that's the community that I pastor. Many have a lot of stories of just really brutal poverty in Mexico. Many wish they could finish high school. Many wish they could. There are some anyway. Some of the older generation wish they could have gone to school at all to learn how to read and those kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
So their educational path was really dictated by poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was like for some of the older gentlemen of our congregation, they're some of the hardest working men I've ever met. But from the time they were children, they weren't allowed to go to school because their dad needed them to work on a farm somewhere to help take care of the family and help provide for their family for just basic food and shelter and clothing. And so they'd never had an opportunity to go to school, learn how to read. Others have some schooling, but then had to drop out of school. Usually after grade 8 is pretty common. Then to go and work and again help to provide for the families. Yeah. Yeah.
So how does congregational church life fit into your context? The folks that come to church, is that excuse my ignorance in the questions, but is that part of the cultural expectation that everybody should go to church, or is that just like the rest of Canadian culture where it's often a diminishing property?
Yeah, there are similarities to the kind of trajectory of Canadian culture, but for some of it, it seems like it's kind of set back 10 or 20 years from the trends that we're seeing in Canada. So there is still a general sense that it's good to go to church. And so there would be some that start coming, because they always thought it was good to go to church. And so then they would start coming, but soon discover there's more to faith than just sitting in a pew.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious too about your own pastoral calling. Like, is that something that you knew when you were really young? Is that something that came later in life? How did that all take shape in you?
Well, I had a sense early on that ministry was something that was always near and dear to my heart. So as a child of maybe 12 or 13 years old, it was something that I thought about a lot. I had intended for a while to become a teacher and kind of serve my community by teaching the younger generation in school or whatever. But then after I graduated high school, things kind of took a different turn. I had an opportunity to get involved with a radio ministry in the community I lived in the far north of Alberta, and so spent almost 5 years working there full time. It ran a lot like... Can
you give us the call letters?
CIAM.
CIAM.
Radio, yeah. And the station at the time that I left, I believe it was 18 repeater stations in small little rural areas in northern Alberta, northern BC, and northern Saskatchewan. Predominantly northern Alberta, but it functioned very similarly to Trans World Radio, where we raised support as missionaries in an area to help offset the cost of running the ministry. And so, in the first 2 years of my marriage with my wife, she served with me there as well until I felt it was time to go back to school. So then I attended Providence University College in Manitoba. And from there, in my last year and kind of thinking about what was next, I started to, pastoral ministry had always been kind of on my mind as something I would do. But I thought I was far too young for something like that, but then it started to kind of be impressed on my heart, and I realized that, sometimes God can use young people too in pastoral ministry. And I sent out letters to 4 different churches, and I heard back from 5. And New Life Christian Fellowship was the 5th one that I had never really heard about them. They asked if I would consider coming. And so it kind of caught me so off guard. At first I dismissed it out of hand for a few moments, but then I just couldn't shake the sense that maybe this was something more to this. And so that's where we ended up coming 8.5 years ago now.
So there's a Christian counselor in the Kitchener area, Dick DeGraff, and I once heard him say that, and this, I don't know if this was original to him or he was quoting somebody else, but he said, in life, every man is on 2 journeys. The first journey is the journey away from home, and the second journey is the journey back home. And does that set of footwear, does that fit your feet?
I think so. Yeah. I've certainly really appreciated the sense of family in our congregation, where they've treated my wife and I and our children like family. So it's really a sense of home in that way, where they're like brothers and sisters to us. And I've faced significant health struggles in the past, and my wife is currently going through some herself. And the kind of support that the church offers and provides, just because that's who they are, has been a real sense of family and home. Although in the more superficial things, I certainly miss the rolling hills in Alberta, and
Yeah.
the mountains, and of course the people too. But in terms of the family of God, it's really been beautiful to see that in our congregation.
Yeah, yeah. I'm interested in some of the dynamics between urban and rural.
Yeah.
You know, I think that certainly in rural and small town life, there's often that first journey of leaving home and often heading to the city, whether it's for education or employment. In more of an agricultural culture like you've grown up in, there may be more incentive to not go to the city. I don't know what's
it's in most rural areas they want to retain their youth, and they work hard at this, but especially if there's a growing population, there's just simply not enough jobs for everyone.
Yeah. And
educational opportunities are really limited, and so many people move away on account of that. And so there's, like, my older brother, for instance, when he graduated, he went to school in Edmonton, and that's where he stayed. And so he's been there for probably half his life now at this point. And it's, there's a lot of differences between urban and rural, but there's also a lot of similarities because we're all human beings,
That's it.
And so when we're working with people, and especially working with people in poverty, so much of it comes back to relationships, and the thing is, like, in an urban setting, you can see the poverty a little bit more quickly, especially because of the fact that, in rural centers, there's often limited resources, so there's not things like homeless shelters and soup kitchens and those kinds of resources as readily available,
right, and
as dependable as they would be in an urban context. And so then a lot of the people that are homeless will migrate to cities, we find, it's just easier to survive that way.
Right, the resources and the safety net. Yeah. Thank God for people like your parents. They were a safety net to a lot of people. People who could have just been absolutely decimated and destroyed, found their way through a season. Maybe some of them were able to recover and move forward.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. In your book, in chapter 1, you talk about the poverty in all of us. I was especially curious about the framework of poverty that you borrowed from Professor Bryant L. Myers. You said this, the Genesis story depicts 4 kinds of human relationships and reveals how the root of all poverty can be traced back to the breakdown of those relationships. Myers outlines 4 kinds of relationships depicted in Genesis. Us and God, us and others, us and ourselves, us and creation. So can you open that up for us? This idea that all poverty is a broken relationship. What's that mean?
Yeah, when I encountered this idea from Bryant Myers, it was powerful for me personally as well, to help understand some of my upbringing and the questions I had of were we rich or were we poor. I knew compared to my classmates we were certainly poor, and I'd go to the church youth group and there'd be some trip and it cost $30, and I knew that we were struggling to find $30 to pay the phone bill and something like that. And then to think about asking my parents for $30 for something like that, it was like, no, we can't do that. So I felt really poor. But then, I would see that we'd bring home people, and the kind of household rule, always room for one more. But, so it helps to explain some of that as beyond the superficial layer of poverty that we often think about, and the kind of deeper sense of it. And the first one that Myers mentions is the broken relationship between us and God. And as a pastor and a Christian and a man of faith, that is a very profound one, and for me the most important one. However, that being said, sometimes when there's a breakdown in any of the other 3 relationships, coming to the Lord, as wonderful as that is, may not resolve the material poverty.
Right.
If the source of your material poverty is a different broken relationship. So one of the examples that I give in my book is this young woman that my wife and I had the privilege of talking to about her spiritual questions. And we didn't know her very well, but she came to some of our church events and she was curious about God and the Bible. Mm-hmm. And she loved hearing about Jesus. And so she became a Christian at one point while my wife and I were talking to her, and we were extremely happy about this. But this young woman was kind of couch surfing and living with friends and into some stuff that was really bad for her life, you know. And it turned out that, you know, as wonderful as it was for her to come to the Lord, the source of the material poverty in her life was a broken relationship with her parents. You know, that she was a teenager that had run away from home because of this broken relationship. And in time, someone was able to help mediate between her and her parents, and she was able to go back home, and it resolved a lot of things that way, and she was doing much better then. But just because she came to the Lord, it didn't, you know, resolve the material poverty, because the root of it was this broken relationship with her parents. And that's a common thread through many of the people that stayed with our family when I was growing up too, is there was a broken relationship with their parents that led them to something. And so that is kind of getting into the second one, which is broken relationships between us and others, and our parents is one of those that becomes pretty devastating when there's a broken relationship there. And you know, we sometimes make light of it in our society as, oh, you've got daddy issues or mommy issues or whatever. And we kind of say that in a patronizing way. But yet when those relationships are damaged severely, they have a tremendous impact in our lives and often resulting in material poverty. The third one that Bryant Myers talks about is a relationship with ourselves. And this one is huge. I mean, I'm sure I don't need to tell any of your listeners the impact that mental health and mental illness has on people's material well-being. Yeah. It's just a big one. But even beyond things like mental illness, it's when we internalize our poverty. And this is a big fancy way of saying when we think we're poor because of who we are, that we don't deserve better, or we will never have better, or that we must be cursed, or God hates us, or those kinds of things. When we think those negative and destructive thoughts about ourselves, then we sometimes won't even believe that there can be better. And without a hope and a vision for something better, we won't move in that direction, and we'll settle for a lot less than what we could or should be striving for, to you know, ease our own suffering and poverty, just because we don't think we deserve any better.
Right, and then it can get pathological in the sense that sometimes people in poverty, out of desperation, will believe that if I can just get the money somehow, I'll be able to improve my life, or I'll never have anything, so I'm just gonna stay as low as I can. And that internalizing of poverty is a critical issue, but it's not all economic, is it? It's spiritual.
Yeah, it is.
So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," how do you read that? Blessed are the poor in spirit.
So often, when we are poor, we're aware of our need. You know, we're aware that we don't have it all together. We're aware that we're not the shining example or the crown jewel of humanity or whatever. You know, we know kind of intrinsically that we're broken, you know, and there's a piece of brokenness that in some form in Christianity, without brokenness, we cannot even receive the gospel in the first place. You know, and with that being so kind of real for people that are poor or people that are living in poverty, that sense of knowing that this world is not as it should be, then you are looking for something to give you hope for some kind of future that's not quite so full of suffering.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there's a lot of talk about, systemic racism, systemic poverty, sexism, many isms, many things about the corruption of institutions and corporations, and we're constantly being bombarded in the culture with how broken everything is. And perhaps as followers of Jesus, this needs to be our aha moment to say, this self-awareness in the culture is a good step towards good news.
Yeah.
In chapter 5, you gave, through the book, there's some great stories about people. And in chapter 5, you identify that poverty is not just a broken system. Poverty is people with faces and real names.
Yeah.
And, that it's not just about systemic issues. There are systemic issues, but
certainly. Are
we focused on helping individual people, or are we focused on changing the system, or a bit of both? What do you think?
There's an interesting kind of example about that. Now, briefly in the book, I mention a man named Chris Arnaud. I think that's how you say his name. And he wrote a book called Dignity. I can't remember the subtitle. Something about seeking respect in back row America. He uses the term back row America. And he was a Wall Street banker. And he gave up his job at Wall Street, and he was going to spend time in the places where people said, don't go there. Like the parts of town where they said, stay away from that part of town, or stay away from that city or that community. Just don't go there. That's bad news.
Kind of like the curiosity of Jesus, I think.
Yeah, probably. He's not a man of faith, though he came to have a great deal of respect for churches over the course of this journey that he took. But he writes about this journey of getting into the lives of people who are living in poverty. And one of the interesting things that he talks about is how in so many cities, the community centers often were shut down because of lack of funds, but the center of the communities in a functional way was the McDonald's. And it's because, people could come there no matter what they looked like. They could use the bathroom. They could get something really inexpensive to eat, or just have a coffee or a water or whatever, and people would kind of congregate there and meet. And then when I think about that, he says, you want to know people? Go to the McDonald's and just sit there and watch who are the regulars, watch who hangs out there all day, and then you'll get to know the people who are in need in that community. And I thought about some of the movements in other parts of the country where I lived. And when I lived in Manitoba, there was kind of a growing movement among some people who were studying poverty and talking about it to boycott McDonald's. Right? And it was like a big corporation, and it's, they don't use organic foods or whatever. Like there's this big list of things, and I get it. And it's
not hard to make a case that McDonald's can be offensive.
But
I like it.
and so some people that we knew, they would get really offended if we would suggest that we eat at McDonald's. And it's one of those things where there's a problem with big corporations sometimes. Yes, there absolutely is. And there's I don't want to slander McDonald's on your podcast or whatever, but
they're not one of our sponsors. But if they're listening,
but it's one of those interesting things where as I think about this, I thought, like, it really and truly, for those who the McDonald's is like their community center, it's the playground in the winter for their kids in the play place, and it's the place to warm up when it's cold, then to boycott McDonald's comes from this radical place of privilege
Right.
You know, where so many people who are actually in need rely on their services, you know. And while I understand the reason for that, and there's lots of different boycotts of different businesses, and often for very, very good reasons, but yet it kind of illustrates some of the contrast with some of the systemic stuff versus some of the relational stuff.
Right.
That you want to get to know people, go to the McDonald's and hang out for a couple of days.
If you are privileged in some way,
Yeah.
you need humility about how you judge the world around you.
Yeah.
And this sometimes happens in response to the most vulnerable of our citizens.
Yes.
Is that people will have well formulated opinions on what the people need.
Yeah.
And or they're on a campaign and in the name of being right, trample underfoot the people that they weren't even thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of my indigenous friends and
yeah.
colleagues, well, the one I talk about in the book, I believe I even use his quote. He says, "Nothing for us without us."
Right.
Like, if you're going to make decisions on our behalf, at least include us in this.
Yeah.
You know, let
Yeah.
us come to the table to talk about what's really going on. Another story I tell in the book is this one I heard from a missionary named Gordy. He was a pilot in...
Is that his first name or his last name?
His first
Or both?
name. Yeah. No, I actually can't remember his last name.
Okay.
This is I'm a bit ashamed of that because I really have a lot of respect for this man. He was a pilot in northern Alberta where I lived, and I attended a prayer meeting with some men, and he came to that prayer meeting. So him and I went to the same prayer meeting for years, and I can't remember his last name. But anyways, he did this trip for a couple of years with a ministry called Mercy Ships, where they turned a cruise ship into a hospital. And his wife was a nurse, and he helped out with some of the stuff in the community, you know, digging wells or building stuff or whatever. And when he came back, I was young and curious, and I just peppered him with questions. But he was a bit of an older gentleman and had a lot of patience with me, thankfully. So he told me story after story after story. And one of the stories he told, now I'm not sure if this was something that Gordy was part of, or if it was just something that had happened to people that he had worked with. But they had come to a community and wanted to build a hospital or a school or something. And they walk into the community and they're saying, "All right, we're here to build you a hospital or a school. What would you like?" And they say, "Build us a soccer field." And they're like, No, I don't think you understand. Like, you don't have a hospital. You don't have a school. You need those things first. And they said, "Nope, we don't want those things." And so they deliberated for a while, and eventually they decided, we're going to build them a soccer field. They didn't know what else to do, so they did that. But the elders of that community were far wiser than these people who were insisting on
You need a
school.
hospital, yeah. You need a school,
Yeah, because what had happened in their community is they had become divided, and there was not much unity within their midst. And so they needed a way to encounter one another in a non-confrontational way to help restore relationships. And so when they built a soccer field, well, now the community comes together around a sport, something outside of their previous conflict. They begin to see the humanity within one another and realize that their conflicts can be transcended and that they can resolve them. And then once that happened, the community built their own school and they built their own hospital.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And like the elders of that community, they had seen these things, they built them before, but there wasn't enough unity to maintain these ministries or these buildings. And so it just kind of fell apart until they could heal the divide within these relationships. Then their community was in a bind. And the soccer field facilitated that.
We would do well to learn from that.
Yeah.
You know, to actually consider what people need from what was your indigenous friend? What did he say?
Nothing for us without us.
Nothing for us without us.
Yeah, Kyle Mason was his name.
Oh, Kyle Mason. Yeah, I know Kyle.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, you talked in the book, too, this fascinated me, this idea of the spirals of negative reinforcement or the spirals of positive reinforcement and how that's going on in everybody's life. And what do you mean by the spiral of reinforcement? And is that tied to the notion that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Or is it the antidote to that?
Yes to both. Because there's a sense in which when I talk about spirals of negative reinforcement or spirals of positive reinforcement, in some of its more nefarious kind of applications, it would be the rich get richer and the poor get poorer through whatever reasons. There's also spirals of reinforcement that that can be rather insidious as well, of like bullying leads to depression, anxiety, social behavioral problems because you're scared of being bullied in school or whatever, so you want to isolate and stay home or whatever. So it can lead to these mental illness pieces that or mental health pieces, along with trauma and pain, and then from there you're entering worse than you were before. Once you're bullied at school, then the next day you come back and now you're at a worse starting point, and then if the bullying continues, it exacerbates all of that.
You're circling downward.
And so then it's because of an outside influence, right?
Right.
Others of it is a lot less nefarious. So things like diet, for instance. So one person that I met talked about her journey with depression as an adult, and she would part of her journey out of it was better diet. So what it had been before was money was lacking, and so she would buy the cheapest foods, which is usually your Kraft Dinner or Sidekicks or whatever, the unhealthy stuff, and then her depression would get worse and she'd get sick more often, so she'd miss more work. Less finances meant less ability to buy healthy food, and on it went. It was like a self-reinforcing spiral where every step you took, which was logical at the time, you don't have money, so you buy the like least expensive food you can to fill your belly for that day, but that eventually leads to greater sickness, more problems with depression, and a lack of ability to work as much, because you're taking time off to deal with these other things, which leads to less money, and it just kind of reinforces on itself. But then on the flip side, there's positive spirals of reinforcement where, as just kind of a really, really simplified example that's almost painfully simple, like I had a boss when between my years of school, I worked in construction, and I had a boss, great guy, so this is nothing wrong with anything he was doing here, but he had a business, and he'd put the materials that we'd be working with for a given job, renovating someone's house or whatever, he would put them on his company credit card, right? And then he gets paid, he pays off the credit card, but as he did this, his credit card accumulates points,
right? And
then he gets points, you get free flights, you get basically free vacations, which are good for your mental health. You come back refreshed, ready to work more, your business thrives, you get more points, more free vacations, on and on it goes. And it's a positive spiral, or like this woman I met. Right.
So the positive spiral of work smarter, not harder.
That would be one way of putting it. Yeah. Or like that lady I spoke with with her journey, she started to make the choice to eat healthy. She got healthier, missed less work, had more money, could better afford to eat healthy. But it's sometimes like, these are just very simple examples, but there's like multiple spirals sometimes happening at once that can reinforce each other. So you could have depression, you could have bullying, you could have abuse issues, you could have family of origin struggles, you could have issues with your employers, working, doing illegal things or whatever. Like that's sadly common for a lot of people, where employers will dock pay for illegal reasons and that sort of thing. One of those white collar crimes that's sadly rampant in a lot of places. And then it just kind of reinforces itself in a negative way. But then so too, like one example, when my wife started working, her job came with some benefits. And so then it was cheaper for us to buy glasses and prescriptions, but we had more money now. It was easier for us to buy glasses and prescriptions, but now that it was easier, we didn't have to pay full price. I was floored when I bought these glasses, because this is pretty recent. So I bought these glasses, and I was like, I didn't have to save up for a few months for these. this is unreal. I just went to the store and bought new glasses because we could afford it any month because the insurance covered so much of it. And so then it made it affordable. And my wife was working then, so we had, more income, and I could have saved up in a month or two instead of 3 or 4, and it was just, it seems like a positive spiral in that sense. And some of them I think are just, they're not, some are nefarious where it's like imposed from outside and it's the result of evil, but not all of them are. Some of them are just neutral, like the results of our own choices,
right,
for instance.
Right. So if we pull that into the paradigm that Myers presents about poverty being a broken relationship, there's this sense, and maybe is that one maybe more about the relationship to ourself?
Often, and other people.
And other people, yeah.
Yeah. And well, and our environment as well, too, I would say. My wife worked in a community in northwestern Ontario, and that community had, as a result of uncontrolled industrial processes, has had mercury dumped into a waterway. And the community she lived in was downstream from the factory that did that. And this is all well documented in the news. The community's Grassy Narrows, if people want to look it up. Yeah. But it's it created a lot of health issues there, and so you have neurological problems from mercury poisoning. It's going to lead to, different spirals that reinforce each other that make life more difficult for people.
Right.
And so then
broken relationship with creation.
Yeah.
That creates this incredible poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah. In your book on page 77, you quote Henry Nouwen, and you had me at Henry. There we go. But there's this quote from Henry Nouwen I want you to talk about. This is dealing with the issues that arise with power. And Nouwen says, "The long, painful history of the church is the history of people ever and again tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross, being a leader over being led. One thing is clear to me: the temptation of power is greatest when intimacy is a threat. Much Christian leadership is exercised by people who do not know how to develop healthy, intimate relationships and have opted for power and control instead. Many Christian empire builders have been people unable to give and receive love." I read that, wow. Unable to give and receive love. It's this temptation that faces us, the tension between empire and shalom. Which way are we going to have it?
Yeah.
And do you think that, in our current age of, building a brand and social media presence and writing books and having a podcast and creating a platform, does this somehow set us up once again to build many empires? And do we do so at the peril of building intimacy? And I'm not pointing that finger at you. I'm asking the question for myself. Right? What Henry seems to be saying here is that you can miss the shalom of God, the plan, the peace, the perfection of what God has, and get tempted to build an empire instead.
Yeah, and I asked those same questions of myself even before I started writing the book. It was like, is this just that empire building? Or, I wanted to make sure I went into it without that kind of motive or whatever. And then I get emails from the publisher about building your brand and all of that, and I'm just, I don't want to speak ill of my publisher because I'm very, very grateful for them. Yeah. However, there's a tension certainly that's there between that, and I don't think that it's necessarily inherently wrong to write a book or have a podcast. I think there's actually a lot of good in that, certainly. But I think you hit the nail on the head when we talk about the difference between seeking empire and seeking shalom. And which is one of the reasons in, I believe it was chapter 5, where I talk about the stories of people, with faces and names. That this is something that's not just about look how smart I am or whatever. It's stories about look at what real people are dealing with. Look at what so many people, and we talk about the 1% or whatever, and there's a truth in that. The majority of people in the world deal with the kind of thing I talk about in this book. Deal with poverty. That's most people. Mm-hmm. That's sadly normal. Yeah. If we would talk about the majority. And so then it's something that we would do well to pay attention to beyond issues, but to realize this has a human element to it. And whenever there's a human element, another thing that comes to mind with this is when we try to build something, you can achieve with fear what should be done with love. And this, you see it in broken homes where someone wants the respect of their family and they are failing to achieve it through love because maybe they don't know how to love properly or how to receive love properly. And so then they resort to fear to get the outward actions of respect. Politicians do the same thing. If you can't gain the love of your people, then you control them through other means, and that's one of those things that I think whoever of us is in the helping professions or seeking to make a difference, that we don't mix those two up, because you can get the outward results through fear, but that is no substitute for love. And I'd rather see someone take 2 steps in love than 100 in fear. Mm-hmm. The outward appearance might look like a failure in comparison, but before the Lord, you're, 102 steps ahead of the other guy. Yeah. Final bit here. Yeah.
How can people get a copy of your book, Faithful in Small Things, How to Serve the Needy When You're One of Them? And also tell us a little bit about Pov.ology.
Yeah. You can get my book on Amazon or order it through Indigo or Barnes & Noble or whatever. Mm-hmm. Also at the Herald Press website, you can get it from there as well, and they've got links to most of the most popular retailers out there.
I'll put links in the show notes, yeah.
And it's on Audible as well as an audiobook for people who like that.
Do you get to read your own book?
I did. Actually, I insisted on it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, given that I was in radio, I felt like it would be a shame.
Morgan Freeman wasn't available. She thought, I'll do it myself.
Well, I turned him down. No, I'm just kidding. No, I wanted to read it in my own voice, and it's one of... maybe a little bit selfish in some ways. I've always wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy doing that.
You also have radio background, so you're comfortable with your voice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was quite a bit of fun. Although because we live in rural area, little background note, I had to pause my recording one time because my chickens were right outside my window, and I had to go get some feed corn and lure them away to the backyard, and then dump it back there so I could go back to recording.
I would have just added to the ambience. You reading, ripping your soul open and bleeding and chickens in the background.
Yeah, cock-a-doodle-doo. Yeah. But then as far as Pov.ology goes, I came up with the name because I was the predominant theme of it is poverty and theology. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, let's mash those words together, Pov.ology. And the nice thing about inventing a word is if you Google it, it's the only thing that comes up. So that works. Also, Pov.ology.com. You can access the series. If anyone has access to Right Now Media as well, it's on there. Okay. And so you can. There's also a free. The whole series is free. It's on YouTube. It's on Pov.ology.com. There's links to the YouTube videos. You can download it there too, the MP4s, for free. We're a small church, and so we love resources that are made available to those who don't have resources. So we did the same thing.
Oh, and you got a who's who of social justice on.
Shane Claiborne and Ron Sider are on there. Kyle Mason, who I mentioned, as well as a professor from Canadian Mennonite University, Ray Vanderzag. He was a fantastic interview. He teaches international development at CMU, and so just wonderful wisdom from him as well. There's Linda Chamain from Saskatoon, who runs an inner city outreach there called The Bridge, I believe it was. And oh man, there's like a dozen people or more. So it's a great
resource for small groups, for churches that are saying, hey, how can we better position ourselves in relationship to people and understanding poverty, our own and that of our neighbors.
And for churches, there's been a number of churches that have used it as a resource for their missions trips when they want to go somewhere to serve in missions trips, that they go through it together before they go to help better prepare them so they can talk through some of the conversations about what to expect and how to avoid doing more harm than good and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I just have so appreciated your book and your insights and who you are. And one of the reasons that I continue to do this podcast with regularity is I just love seeing what God is at work doing in our country. And you didn't fit in as an urban ministry worker, but you sure have the ethos. And you know, and you said something really important too, that you know, when you really break it down, the difference between rural and urban, the bottom line is people are people, wherever you find them. And you just happen to find a lot more of them congregated in the city. And so thanks so much for being on, and we'll have to do this again.
Thank you, Kevin.
Kevin Aaron Wiebe, and his book, Faithful in Small Things. I have a copy that I'm going to make available. We're going to have a contest. If you would go to the Facebook page for Sidewalk Skyline podcast, I've listed all of the episodes that we've aired from Season 1 and Season 2, and there's a contest there if you are able to pick the top most listened to episode in 2021, as well as the second and third most listened to. The person who scores the highest will win a copy of Kevin's book. So go to the Facebook page now and do that. The contest won't be on for too long. So our next guest is somebody I work with who lives in Montreal and works in Montreal, Gary Connors. Gary is the Mission Canada, Quebec and Francophone Canada director. You know, Quebec is the largest mission field in the Western Hemisphere. It is the least Christianized place, and which is odd because historically in Canada, Quebec was largely Catholic, but today probably only about 5% of Catholics attend church in Quebec, and less than 1% of Christians in Quebec would be belonging to an evangelical church. So a lot of interesting things. One of the things Gary does is he's the director for Fit for M, bringing English Canadians to Quebec, involving them in intensive French language training in preparation for ministry in French within Quebec. And so we'll hear a lot about that next time we get together on this podcast. So until that time, you know who I am, and you're listening to Sidewalk Skyline podcast.